Hey guys, welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Becca and today I am going to be talking about why I no longer love young adult fantasy. Now this is not going to be a video where I say young adult fantasy is terrible now, it's awful, it was great 5 years ago, now it's all trash. This is just going to be me talking about my personal experience with young adult fantasy over the last couple of years. I had an epiphany the other day and really discovered the reason why I haven't been loving young adult fantasy as much recently, and it is nothing to do with the books, with the quality of the books. In this video I'm going to be talking about my thought process, like the things that I thought it was originally, like the reasons maybe why I wasn't loving young adult fantasy, and then the reason that I stumbled on a couple of weeks ago about what it is about young adult fantasy now that is just making me not as invested as I used to be. So before we get into this, I would like to quickly mention that this video has once again been sponsored by the lovely Skillshare. Skillshare are an online learning community that have thousands of classes that span a wide range of topics. You can take a Skillshare class in anything from baking, illustration, specific software, business management, well-being, lifestyle. The range of topics they have are almost limitless, and there is a Skillshare class out there for pretty much anybody who would like to either brush up on skills or learn something new. A class that I took recently that I really enjoyed and made me feel really good, which is rare in the current times that we're living in 2020, is Plants at Home, Uplift Your Spirits and Space, taught by Christopher Griffin. This was just a wonderful, positive class taught by somebody who really loves plants, about how to introduce more plants into your home, how to turn your home into a little bit of a green space, and to have plants that actually thrive in your environment. And just the passion that Christopher Griffin has for this topic made me smile. And I did also manage to pick up a few tips as somebody who has bought quite a few plants recently and is not green fingered at all. So not only is Skillshare incredibly useful and accessible, it is also extremely affordable, with an annual subscription costing you less than $10 per month on average. However, I do understand that taking out a new subscription-based service can be a little bit daunting, which is why I am happy to let you guys know that the first 1,000 of you guys who click on the link right at the top of my description box will receive a free trial to Skillshare Premium completely free. During this time, you can sample as many classes as you would like, you can complete as many classes as you would like, you will not be limited in any way, and you will be able to find out whether Skillshare is right for you. I have been working with Skillshare for quite some time now. I have found them helpful on numerous occasions, so I would recommend that you take me up on this offer if you are looking to learn something new. So on to today's subject. I haven't written any notes for this video. I'm kind of just freewheeling it like I do with most of the videos on my channel actually. But I am going to start off talking about the first things that I thought when I realized that I wasn't enjoying young adult as much. The first one obviously was, am I just growing out of it? Because I am in my late 20s now. Young adult is not my target demographic, and that has been evident in my reading because I have been reading increasingly more adult books, specifically adult fantasy, but adult fiction in general over the last couple of years. I'm kind of transitioning between the two. That being said, I have always enjoyed young adult fantasy. I like the plots, the books sound really interesting to me. I do enjoy a lot of the characters. Something that I do really love that young adult fantasy always provides to me is a level of angst, because I have always said that some of my favorite elements of books are the overly dramatic relationships between characters. So relationship dynamics that would not need to happen if the characters communicated properly to each other, or if they thought a little bit more about the whole picture as opposed to what is directly in front of them at the moment. And even though I am in my late 20s, there are things about adult fiction that I just generally don't relate to. I can't relate to being married for 10 years. I can't relate to having children and being a mother and that being the main focus of my life. And while those things aren't present in every adult novel, they are recurring things because they are common themes that adults deal with. However, they are not relatable to my life. Now, there is an ongoing discussion that I think we will never have a resolution to about how there needs to be a strong new adult demographic for people who are in similar situations to myself, where we're kind of in the bridge between young adult and adult, where our lives are an in-between of these two things. We're obviously too old to completely relate to young adult, but we are not at the stages of your typical adult novel. I'm not going to address that in this video, but it is something that kind of plays into this when I'm saying like, am I too old for young adult? So this is one of the things that I've thrown out. I've decided that I'm not too old for young adult because I do still read middle grade, and I've been out of that demographic for a really long time, but there are things in middle grade novels that do appeal to me and appeal to me at this stage in my life. And I do think that you can enjoy fiction from any demographic at any stage in your life. But that was just kind of the first immediate obvious thought when I realized that I wasn't enjoying young adult as much as I had previously. Like, oh well, you're obviously just getting a little bit too old for it now. You're not in the same stage of your life as you were, so these things no longer apply to you. The second theory I had is the one that I was convinced for the longest time was the reason why I don't love young adult as much anymore, and that is that young adult has become and is still becoming increasingly more commercialized and marketable. There is no denying that young adult sells well, especially in the online book community, because pretty much as long as the young adult book community has existed, the people who have been in that community have been predominantly people who are in the age ranges that read young adult. So this is all conjecture. This is not based on any facts at all, but as publishers have been utilizing the online book community to market books, as people in the community have become influencers as opposed to just a community of readers who talk about books for fun, young adult has sold more and young adult has become more profitable and more marketable. And what we start to see generally in any industry when something like this happens is that if consumers are continually buying one type of thing, if they continually want to consume one type of thing, then the people at the top will start to pump out more of that type of thing because people want it and they can make money like that. So what this results in, sometimes, not all the time, is a product of lesser quality being introduced onto the market because they are going for quantity over quality. So my thought process with this is that maybe young adult is not at the standard that it used to be, because now it is increasingly easier for authors to sell young adult novels because publishers want them, agents want them. I do think that this happens to some extent, but I do not think that this is always the case. The thing with art is that it is always subjective. People have personal preferences, and that definitely comes into play when you are critiquing any form of art. But what always happens is that there is a market for that. There are people who will see something in that book that is their absolute favorite thing. So it's not something that can really be quantified, I want to say. It is just a matter of opinion. But this was my leading theory. Young adult has just become more marketable, and because of that, there is a much wider range of young adult fiction than there used to be. And naturally, with so many things, some of them are going to be better than others, once again in quotation marks, because everything is subjective. So the two things that I've just mentioned, one, that I may be growing out of young adult, and two, that young adult has become more marketable, I do believe that both of these things are still true, even though I do not think that they are the leading reason for me not enjoying young adult fantasy as much. So I did want to mention them in this video because they do definitely play a part. Like, you can't deny that I'm in my late 20s and I'm a little bit too old for the typical young adult now, and you cannot deny that young adult has become more marketable, more commercialized. There's a lot of books out there, not all of them are going to be as good and also as enjoyed widely as maybe they used to be. However, what I have now landed upon, the epiphany that I had a couple of weeks ago, is that just personal preference wise with me as a reader and the things that I enjoy in books does not line up with the typical structure of a young adult novel. So what I have been finding over the last couple of years, I'm much more in the online book community than I used to be, which means that I'm much more aware of new releases. And with the marketing push behind these things, with ARCs going out all the time, with me seeing reviews and hype being built, I'm picking up books that are released in that year, and that is something that I never used to do. I used to be much more of a backlist reader because back in the early days of my book collection, I had the space to have as many books as I want, but I didn't have the money to buy them. So I would buy the majority of my books from charity shop, meaning that everything that I was reading was pretty much out of circulation for at least a couple of years. It was rare that I would find something even relatively new. As a reader, I have discovered that I am character driven. The things that stick with me after I finished a book is the characters. I lose details in my mind about the plot, but characters I always remember. I love well-developed characters, and I love books books that focus on characters. Like, if I care about the characters, if I'm scared for the characters, if I have come to think of the characters as people that I care about, the books are more likely to leave a lasting impression on me as opposed to the plot. Now, my favorite books have this grand epic scaled plot that is very intricate, very complex. It has things being pulled in that you read, like if it's a series, things that you read at the beginning of the series being relevant to the end of the series, and characters that you followed for a long time, that you've really grown with, that you've really come to love. Now, young adult fantasy as a demographic is not inherently more plot driven. However, with me personally, reading books as they are released, what I am finding is that the typical structure, and this does not apply to every young adult book, but the typical structure I have noticed in my own personal experience, it isn't like a rule or anything, but with the books that I've been reading, I have noticed that you will have a plot arc in the first book in a young adult fantasy series. So I feel like I should use something as an example. Do I have anything around me I can use as an example? Okay, so we're gonna go with a real classic example here. We are going to go with the Grisha trilogy by Leigh Bardugo. So Shadow and Bone. Alina is a normal girl in Ravka. She's been drafted to the army. However, right at the beginning of this book, she discovers that she has powers. Because of these powers, she is taken to the Grisha Academy, where she is trained to use her powers, where she meets the Darkling, the leader of the Grisha army, who is very seductive, very alluring, and very powerful. The main conflict in this world is that we have something called the Shadowfold, and that is full of these dark writhing beasts, which means that the country is disconnected from one half to the other because crossing the Shadowfold is difficult. That is the conflict that is introduced in here. The Shadowfold is a big issue that they have to deal with, but as soon as Alina joins the Grisha Academy, she starts to realize some of the intricate politics of the world, things about the different factions, things about the Darkling and the Ravkan royalty. What I have noticed in young adult that is illustrated with this series in particular, in the way that the trilogy is structured, is that we are introduced in book one to a plot arc. This is understandably an introduction to the characters, the magic system, politics of the world, and the world building. What happens typically, in my experience, is that the initial plot arc that we are introduced with, like the initial problem, is resolved throughout the first book, and the first book focuses on this plot, and you are learning more about the magic, the politics, and the world as we go. But by the end of the first book, generally the minor plot arc is resolved, resulting in a problem arising right at the end of the book, which is an introduction to the greater plot of the series that is only going to be explored in books 2 and 3. So the actual plot of the first book is not normally a reflection of the series. That usually comes at the end of the first book. Then what you have with the second book is a much slower story. Now, the second book in a young adult series, in my experience yet again, is designed to bring you closer to the characters, further develop all of the things that were introduced in book 1, so magic, politics, and world. Normally expands the world a little bit. The setting of this one is very isolated in comparison to this one, and introduces you to what the end game of the series is going to be. So the actual plot of the series normally only comes into play in book 2 and 3, but this is the book that is generally a lot slower and brings you a lot closer to the characters. Popular opinion on the second book in a series is that the majority of readers actually find that the second book in a series is their least favorite because it is so much slower. However, personally, I find, and this is a perfect example actually, especially in the Grisha series, Siege and Storm is my favorite of the three, because as a reader, I am more drawn to characters and I enjoy the character building that typically happens in book 2 of a series. Then when you move on to book 3, you have the resolution of the greater plot that was vaguely introduced in book 1, developed in book 2, and comes to its epic conclusion in book 3. So that is what I've noticed is a typical young adult series structure. So what is happening with me as a reader when I'm reading books as they are released is that I'm reading book 1, which is mainly plot driven and follows a minor plot arc that is not reflective of the series as a whole, and I'm leaving book 1 feeling unsatisfied because I'm not enjoying it, because the typical young adult first book in a series structure, themes, everything going on here is not my personal taste as a reader. But because I'm reading the first book in the series the year that it is released, what I'm finding that is difficult to how I used to read is that I now have to wait a year until book 2 in that series. So what I would normally do, like if I read the Grisha series for the first time now, I would read book 1. I would think this has some elements that I like. I didn't love it because of whatever reasons. It didn't really hit the spot for me, but I would still continue with the series. Then I would pick up book 2, think actually I do really enjoy this series. Book 2 contained all of the elements that I really like in a book, and now I really need to see how it ends, and I would pick up book 3. But if I'm reading this the year that it's released, I have a year to wait until I can read this, and by the time that year has passed, I'm not as interested in this as I would have been if I was able to pick it up as soon as I'd finished this one. And that is pretty much why I am unsatisfied with all of the young adult that I'm reading. It is because I'm reading them as soon as they're released, and I'm not enjoying them enough because of the typical formula of a first book in a young adult series, and by the time a year has passed, my attention has waned and I'm less likely to pick up the sequel. So it is not young adult fantasy, it is what I like to read in books and how I'm reading them, like the time frame that I'm reading them on. So I don't really know what I'm gonna do about that. I don't know whether I should stop reading these books in the year that they're released and wait until at least the second book is released, because I feel like if I read the first 2 books almost back to back, I won't mind waiting a year for the third book, and when the third book is released, assuming it's a trilogy of course, this structure I'm talking about is more typical with trilogies, but I won't mind the wait for the third book as much because I've read enough of the series to be actually hooked and make it so that I am excited for the release of the third book and that I will actually pick it up when it's released. But yeah, I don't know how to do that because part of my job, part of what I do here is that I read arcs. Now I don't get that many arcs, especially not physical arcs. I have been requesting more on NetGalley recently, but as a reviewer, as a booktuber, part of my job is to read these books before they're released and let you guys know whether they're worth your time. Now I have never really put much thought into being an influencer as opposed to somebody who just talks about my love of books. It's just something that kind of happens over time, so it is quite possible for me to go back to only reading books that have been released, like only reading backlist, as long as I don't get swept up in the hype of wanting new books, wanting to read new books based on the reviews of other people. So that brings us pretty much to the end of this video. That is the reason why I think at this minute I think I haven't been enjoying young adult fantasy as much. Please let me know down in the comments whether you have been feeling like this, whether this video maybe helped you to work through why you haven't been loving young adult fantasy as much. I mean, the first 2 reasons that I touched upon in this video, like growing out of young adult and also young adult maybe becoming more commercialized, are also valid reasons to not read as much young adult anymore or think that you're not loving young adult as much anymore. But for me, I definitely do think that it is the standard young adult formula, because while I haven't been loving all young adult, there are some that I've read in the last couple of years that I do really enjoy, and as I mentioned earlier, not every single young adult book does fall into this formula. It is just a popular structure. So I do think that is about it for this video. Once again, thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this one. If you would like to take me up on my offer of a free trial to Skillshare Premium, the link will be at the top of my description box. Aside from that, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it and subscribe if you wanna. If you head to my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, Instagram and Twitter if you'd like to follow me on any of those, as well as a link to my Bookish body butter and candle website, the Instagram for that, and 10% off discount code. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye!
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you will go and nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.